One West Hebrew Israelites love to use 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2, because they believe it somehow establishes Israelites as Gentiles. Well, it does no such thing. This idea of Gentiles meaning Israelites in a Gentile state of mind, or Israelites who don't keep the law, or the northern kingdom. Well, we can't go into any lexicon, we can't go into any Bible dictionary and find that that's a meaning of the term. But let's go into this particular text and see what's actually going on here, contrary to the assertions they make. The NASB renders it, "You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to the mute idols." The King James Version says, "Ye know that ye were Gentiles, carried away unto these dumb idols." Here, pagans or Gentiles is translated from the Greek ethne, which is the plural of ethnos. When we look at the analytical lexicon of the Greek New Testament as it defines ethnos, it says generally nation, people. Plural ta ethne, used to designate non-Jews, Gentiles, nations, foreigners. Opposite leos, in a negative sense, pagans, heathens. So from a lexical perspective, both the King James Version and the New American Standard Bible are accurate. It can be rendered pagan, heathen. It can be rendered Gentiles. It could technically be rendered nations, though that wouldn't really fit this particular text. There's clearly a distinction and a distinctive element to their identity that's being highlighted here. And in particular, it has to do with their worship. You were led away unto mute idols. And so when it says this, it's referring to the fact that these believers at Corinth were in times past led to idol worship. And so those who are of the Hebrew Israelite persuasion, they'll say, see, this means that it's Israelites who were worshiping idols. Well, there may have been Israelites who were worshiping idols, but there's no basis in particular for saying that this text is referring to them. Anyone who was raised to worship idols was led astray into that worship. That's what they were taught from childhood. And so these believers in Corinth were such ones who had been misled into doing this. But why is it that Paul is saying you were this thing? What is the differentiation? Well, he makes it clear as we go earlier into 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32 says, "Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks, or to the church of God." The King James Version renders it, "Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God." Now, the difference between Greeks and Gentiles between the two translations is simply a point of emphasis. Greeks, broadly speaking, was used in the first century to refer to anyone who is not an Israelite. And so that's why the King James Version renders it as Gentiles. It is the Greek word Hellene, here in the plural, Helesin. And so what is key here is that Paul distinguishes both Jews and Greeks from the church. In other words, if you are a part of the church, you used to be a Jew or a Gentile. But wait, Paul's a Jew, right? Well, yes, he is. In Galatians 2:15, speaking to Peter, he says, "We are Jews by nature." Yet in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, he says, "To the Jews, I became as a Jew, so that I might win the Jews." So the distinction that Paul is making is not one of ethnicity, but one of religious identity. And so as a result, Paul is able to take ethnic Gentiles and yet say, you were Gentiles. In fact, in the book of Ephesians, we see a very similar distinction. In Ephesians 3:1, we find, "For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles." So Paul is writing to believers within the church, and yet they are still Gentiles. Well, this is where the ethnic identity and the religious distinction now come into play when we go into chapter 4. In verse 17, he says, "So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. So while the ones Paul is writing to are still Gentiles, they are also distinguished from the Gentiles, the broader group that is religiously darkened in the futility of their mind and excluded from the life of God. In Romans chapter 11, Paul also speaks of their ethnic identity when he says in verse 13, "But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry." Now he says they are Gentiles, but these are believers in the church, as we see in verse 17. "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, that is the Gentiles, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them." So these ones have already been grafted in, but they're still Gentiles. Well, how is it they're still Gentiles here, but they were Gentiles in 1 Corinthians 12 too? Again, it is ethnic identity versus religious identity. Ethnically, they are non-Israelites. Religiously, they are now part of the church of God. So when it comes to the text in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2, they were no longer pagans. They were no longer heathens. That's the point, and that's the emphasis with the word Gentiles, even in the King James Version. It is their religious identity that they no longer associate with because they are now part of the church of God. And so when we look at this text, it is fully explained by 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32. They are now a distinctive group, distinct both from Jews and Gentiles, though they trace their ethnic identity back to both.